she's the activist in the family. Actually, she's a former educator. Actually, she's still educating. She now volunteers at some of the schools in Pasadena. And by the way, we live in Pasadena now. And for those of you who don't know, our little city of Pasadena, the Crown City, so much culture there really, has more private schools than any other city over 100,000 per capita. Our next door neighbor is a Mayfield School for Girls. I mean, everywhere you look. My colleague on the district court, Manuel Real, ordered the desegregation of the Pasadena schools. A few years ago, at the 50th anniversary of Brown, I was asked to write an article for the Los Angeles County Bar. And I did. And I talked about how Pasadena, wonderful Pasadena, cultural Pasadena, followed what happened in the deep South, in Georgia and Mississippi and other places. White flight that exists to this day. No one would have thought that it would be quite that way. And listening, and I'm so glad that I don't have to respond to some of the questions from members of this distinguished bench, because I don't really know the answer. You know, my wife said to me sometime that you have two problems when you speak. And I said, well, what's that? She said, well, one is that you wander from your subject. And I said, okay. And she said, what's the other one? She said, well, you come back to it. We wander 1 minute. And when I talked about the 6 degrees of separation, when I listened to the dean, who was a dear friend, one of the brightest and most thoughtful people that I know, and most important, one of the kindest individuals I've ever known. When he talked about the graduate school cases that preceded, and one of them, of course, was Missouri XRL Gaines. And during the Second World War, I was a small child, and I'd never been south, but my father's older sister took me south. My father was fighting in Okinawa at the time, and my uncles were fighting in Italy and Germany. And I'd never seen cotton before. Of course, I'd never, you know, if I'd been in California, I would go over Kern County, I would have seen an awful lot. But I saw cotton for the first time. But I also, I was living in Chicago, that's my hometown, born and raised there. And in the midst of de facto segregation, I went to the largest grade school in the nation, over 4,000 kids, 110% black, the student population. There were a few white teachers and the principal who was there when my mother had gone there. And yet, I feel I got a quality education, though, because we had music and art in the schools, things that we don't have now. And I think about some of the questions that you're asking. What are we going to do about the quality of education apart from race and all? And, of course, I don't want it to be apart from race because I think diversity is a good part of the education. But I grew up in that kind of a situation, then went to a high school that was 95% Jewish. In fact, it was so overwhelmingly Jewish, and the largest population of minorities was Nisei. The kids of those families where we as Americans committed one of the worst crimes apart from what we did to the Native Americans and slavery, imprisoning our Japanese American citizens. So many of them were allowed then to move into the Middle West, and most came to Chicago. But this school was so overwhelmingly Jewish that the captain of the football team my junior year was a fellow named Fred Yamashiro, and they used to call him Freddie Yamashapiro, But it was a wonderful educational atmosphere. Went from there to being and listening to talking about perhaps being an orphan among whites and all. I was the only black student at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. But you didn't think about race after a time, except when I had to go get a haircut. I had to go to New York or to Boston or New Haven. You couldn't get one in Middletown, Connecticut. But other than that, it was a wonderful experience. Then I went into the military, and there, President Truman had just given his executive order to integrate the armed services. And I had the rudest awakening in my life. And again, the 6 degrees of separation. I hear Ms. Brown Henderson talk about her father being an AME minister. My grandfather was an AME presiding elder, and I went to Sunday school every Sunday too, and that sort of thing. But I never prayed as much as I did when I went in the military. I tried to get it out of the way between college and law school, and I went with some friends of mine who were at Howard University, and took the train and went there with them, looking for a recruiting officer who would give me a 2-year enlistment so I wouldn't have to spend so long. And I finally found a guy in Alexandria, Virginia. He'd met his quota for the month, so he said, sure, I'll give you a 2-year enlistment. And told me to report the next morning. I did, and I thought I was going to go to New Jersey and then be able to go back up to Wesleyan, Connecticut, for the homecoming weekends. I had the rudest awakening in my life. He said, here's a plane ticket. I said, what for? He says, you're going to Columbia, South Carolina. I'd only been south once in my life, and I swear, I never prayed so much. God, please don't let him call me boy. Let me just get through this. And when I get there were only about 4 of us that spoke English. Everyone else spoke Southern. It was that kind of a situation. And they had these so-called Geechee sergeants, drill sergeants. They're Portuguese and black, or African, from the islands off of Georgia and South Carolina. And you couldn't understand a damn thing that they were saying, but you knew that you better double time anytime you saw them, So I went through that process and finished the second 8 weeks, where you're supposed to then get your final assignment. And I finished first in clerk typist school because I was the only one that could speak English, and I could type 25 words a minute. And came time for the assignments, and they were sending people to Europe, and I said, oh, this is great. I've never been to Europe. And then I'll be able to come back and go to law school. And they came to me, and they said, you're going to California. I said, California? I've never been west of St. Louis in my life. I'll go practice law there. And that's why I go back again, that as a result of Missouri Extra Gains, they went to that law school that was set up for blacks, the Lincoln Law School. And then they became very prominent lawyers in St. Louis. In fact, my Aunt Margaret died just last year, 92, still practicing as an endowed chair for her at Washington University of St. Louis and all. And her father was one of the architects of the case dealing with that's why I've taken senior status. The discriminatory housing restricted covenants.
The Rumford Fair Housing Act cases?
Well, before that, yes, Shelley V. Kramer, thank you. And was that from one of my colleagues here? No, good. But and at the memorial service for Aunt, they indicated that they were going to name the street on which this black person was finally able to move into a house for Margaret Bush Wilson. But anyway, went from Chicago to California to work for the very first minority U.S. attorney in the history of the nation, Cecil F. Poole, who was appointed by President Kennedy. And then later had the honor of swearing in this U.S. attorney. He was the first Haitian American to ever be U.S. attorney in this country. So it's been quite a ride. And all the way along, I've thought about Brown versus the Board of Education, because as the PJ pointed out, it came about just at the time that I was graduating from college. And our commencement speaker was Earl Warren. And a few years later, when I was working for Cecil Poole, Earl Warren came to visit our chief judge, and I got to meet him then. And what so many people don't realize is that we all remember Thurgood Marshall, but we don't think about all the other individuals who argued, the Bob Carters, the Spotwoods, Robinsons, Oliver Hill. There was one black lawyer in all of Delaware who argued that case before the Chancery Court there. I mean, there are just so many other people who ought to be known. My wife's father, Louis Martin, who was the deputy chairman of the Democratic National Committee under President Kennedy, later the executive assistant to President Johnson, and then later to President Carter, and very instrumental in getting minorities Unto the Bench, for example, Thurgood Marshall was one of those. Spotswood Robinson later, Bob Carter. And then there was Jack Greenberg. And again, the 6 degrees of separation. At our Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference just a few years ago, I was charged with trying to bring together some of these people from Brown v. Board and get them in the same room. It was very difficult because Bob Carter and Jack Greenberg would not speak to each other. And Jack Greenberg, as some of you may know, followed Thurgood Marshall as the head of the Inc. Fund, and Bob Carter thought that he should have had that position, and perhaps so. But they were both wonderful lawyers and both did so much. And let me finish, since I have gone over my time, that Brown v. Board was the jumping off point for what I think is the most important period in our nation's history. And I'm so frustrated that our young people have no real connection with recent history. And of course, so much of recent history is during my lifetime, because I'm that old. But I'm so glad that you're videotaping this. Hope you can get it into the schools so they can listen to these fine young lawyers, listen to Mrs. Brown Henderson, listen to Dean Chemerinsky, to get some sense of how we happen to be where we are now. It didn't just start with our teenagers, and I'm talking about kids of all ethnicities. They just have no real understanding of how we got here. We stand on the shoulders of so many, and Brown v. Board was the jumping off point for the civil rights era, which really is the most, I think, morally important period in our nation. It was a coming together of people of various ethnicities who were indeed people of goodwill. And those are people now who are going to have to help us solve the problems that we face, because we don't know the answer. But as you read from this bench, the Chief Justice read from the bench. It was only 11 pages. He also authored the Miranda decision. It was 61 pages. He did the, one man, one vote. That was over 50 pages. So it probably doesn't fit among the finest of jurisprudence, but in terms of moral responsibility of this nation, it has no match. And I just hope that, and I used to really be so disappointed with all deliberate speed, but as I've gotten older, I understand that if we could just now move with all deliberate speed to try to answer some of these questions that you were putting, to really reach the quality of education for all of our children, and diversity being part of it, then I would accept that. But instead, I think we've gone backwards. But thank you anyway for listening to my personal perspectives, which are more personal than historic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judge Hall. I have to say, Mr. Barat, Mr. McRae, Mr. Poon, thank you very, very much for participating in the event, the time and effort that you've invested in preparation for this event. And I have to say that because somewhere in the kitchen, as I say those words, it's a cue to the people in the kitchen to start bringing out the refreshments. In the interest of time, I was going to skip past that, but I thought if I did, the refreshments would be out there by the time we adjourn. And we will adjourn in 2 or 3 minutes. I can tell Justice Ward is getting anxious. So we will have to adjourn soon. Mr. Buckley, our deepest gratitude for accepting this role and doing it so well. You've handled what is otherwise a difficult case and role in this reenactment. You've handled it extraordinarily well. Dean Chemerinsky isn't here, but our continued best wishes and thanks to him. And Judge Hatter, we now have 2 things in common. If it's reassuring to you, you should know that my colleagues, too, think that I digress and unfortunately find my way back to the topic. I'm reminded of that all of the time. They're probably thinking that right now. The second thing that we share in common, you may recall years ago when we were talking about our respective jobs, I as the presiding justice of this court, you as the presiding judge of the Central District Court, and the huge glut of cases you were handling in Los Angeles and we were handling here. in Riverside, and you asked me about my job, and I said, you know, oftentimes I feel like I'm a caretaker of a cemetery. And you said, oh, why is that? And I said, because I have a lot of people underneath me as the presiding justice, but no one's really listening to me. And you talked to me about that very same experience. So we have two things in common. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here this afternoon to share all of those wonderful moments with us. Ms. Henderson, what can I say to you on behalf of my colleagues and on behalf of all here this afternoon, except to say again a very, very special thank you to you for coming all of this distance from Kansas to be here with us and to share the wonderful personal stories about your family and the others, just as important, all of the others who are involved in this lawsuit, and particularly about your father. Very genuine, very heartfelt. You've given us, I believe, an insight and a perspective into this case that all of the books and all of the literature and all of the case law that we could read would not have given us the insight that you've given us this afternoon. And for that, we all thank you very, very much. And of course, what can I say about Justice Gabbard, that after his 102nd birthday that he celebrated just a couple of months ago, that he's taken the time to be here with us this afternoon. And I know that all of you here in this room and in the satellite rooms as well will join me in continuing to wish him the very, very best. And hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you on your 103rd or 104th birthday. Quick thank you to my wonderful colleagues. I take great pride in always saying to those who are with me in the audience area when my colleagues take the bench, what a gifted and hardworking and talented group of men and women that I have the great honor and the great pleasure to work with and to be with and to enjoy their company. It's a very collegial group of men and women, and who also happen to be the hardest working Court of Appeal in the state of California. And to take time from their schedules and all their other commitments to prepare for an event and a moment like this makes my job as a presiding justice that much more enjoyable and rewarding and special, but it's all a tribute to them. And so we have a number of people that I would like to thank and give our gratitude to, particularly all of these hardworking men who are recording this. Judge Hatter, they are recording it for educational purposes. And so I think that's a benefit to all of us. All too often, we forget our history. And this will be a good reminder. Thank you to them. Thank you to Paula Garcia, the clerk of the court, our managing attorney, Don Davio. And there are many, many others, ladies and gentlemen, who have worked so hard to make this event happen. I won't mention them by name. They know who they are. And we all join in saying thank you to them. So if you are enjoying the reception and you run into someone from our Court of Appeal, tell them how much you appreciate the effort and the hard work that they put into this. And finally, we have approximately 50 to 60 to 70 exhibits, artwork throughout the building, upstairs, downstairs. I would invite you to get some refreshment and then tour the building. Ms. Simonette Loy from the Skirball Museum, the High Museum, and others have joined in delivering all of this wonderful artwork that is situated throughout the building. And we have quite a bit of framed artwork, posters, important historical memorabilia that the Brown Foundation sent to us in a massive footlocker. We were so excited when we received that footlocker and opened it, and there were all of these wonderful framed historical memorabilia that are now sitting throughout the building. So again, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much. We are in recess.
Please rise.